Welcome back to the Paranormal State, Washington, and UFO UAP. With Makāula Nakae, a lifelong experiencer and ET contactee since 1990. Today's episode, 05 Kenneth Arnold sighting, June 24, 1947. Paranormal State's PNW, Washington. It all began in June 1947 with a rapid-fire succession of high strangeness events. First came the Maury Island incident on June 21st, followed just 3 days later on June 24th by Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier and his landing in Yakima. Together, these events set the wheel in motion and birthed the modern UFO era. While Kenneth Arnold's legendary June 24, 1947 sighting officially took place near Mount Rainier, occurring as he flew his private airplane from Chehalis to Yakima. Yakima played a crucial role in the very genesis of modern ufology. On the day of his historic sighting, Arnold was searching for a crashed marine transport plane near Mount Rainier. When Kenneth Arnold took off on the afternoon of June 24, 1947, his flight was not initially a leisure trip or a dedicated UFO hunting expedition. He was flying his single-engine Call Air aircraft from Chehalis, Washington, toward his home and business in Boise, Idaho, with a scheduled fueling stop in Yakima. However, before crossing the Cascade Range, Arnold made a strategic detour north toward Mount Rainier for a very specific reason. He was searching for a missing U.S. Marine Corps transport plane. A short time earlier, a U.S. Marine Corps C-46 commando transport aircraft carrying dozens of service members had crashed into the rugged glacial slopes of Mount Rainier and vanished. Despite initial efforts, the wreckage had not yet been located. To accelerate the search, a $5,000 reward, equivalent to over $70,000 today, was offered to anyone, civilian or military, who could successfully spot and locate the crash site. As an experienced mountain pilot, a member of the Idaho Aerial Search and Rescue Network, and a former deputy fire marshal accustomed to scanning rugged terrain, Arnold decided to use his flight path past Mount Rainier to scan the treacherous snowfields and deep valleys for signs of the downed transport. It was precisely because Arnold was flying off his standard vector, banking his plane and scouring the high-altitude glacial terrain near the 9,500-foot level of Mount Rainier that his eyes caught the sudden, blinding flash of light. Instead of spotting the missing military fuselage or the glint of a crashed C-46 tail section, his gaze locked onto the chain of 9 high-speed, disc-like objects weaving through the mountain peaks at supersonic speeds. Adding a layer of eerie historical coincidence to the day, the crashed marine transport was eventually found shortly after Arnold's sighting, discovered by a mountain climber on the southern slopes of Mount Rainier. However, the recovery of the C-46 became shrouded in its own strange anomalies and conflicting official reports. Investigators and researchers later noted bizarre discrepancies surrounding the site, such as reports from search team members claiming that while luggage and gear were intact, human remains were mysteriously absent or accounted for in unusual ways, feeding early post-war rumors of classified military cargo. Ultimately, Kenneth Arnold never claimed the $5,000 reward for the missing plane. His detour into the treacherous weather and high altitudes of Mount Rainier to rescue fallen servicemen instead led him straight into the historical crosshairs of the unknown, transforming a routine search and rescue flight into the birthplace of modern ufology. The tragedy of the U.S. Marine Corps C-46 commando transport plane, which crashed into the South Tahoma Glacier on Mount Rainier on December 10, 1946, claiming the lives of all 32 service members on board, was already a major historical event before Kenneth Arnold ever flew past the mountain. However, the subsequent discovery of the wreckage and the official handling of the site generated an undercurrent of bizarre anomalies and investigator intrigue that has persisted for decades. When a park employee finally spotted glinting metal fragments and the crushed nose section high on the glacier in July 1947, search and rescue teams faced an unprecedented nightmare of high-altitude recovery. The plane had struck the ice at roughly the 9,500 to 10,500-foot level, embedding itself into a dangerously active and rapidly shifting glacial wall. Early reports and independent researchers digging into military archives noted unsettling discrepancies regarding the condition of the interior. While parts of the fuselage were crushed flat by the impact, search teams who first reached the wreckage observed that certain compartments, personal luggage, and military gear appeared surprisingly undisturbed. At the same time, conflicting accounts circulated among civilian climbers and local historians regarding the exact disposition of the bodies. To clarify, this phrasing does not mean that human remains were entirely missing from the crash site. Because the C-46 Commando struck a massive, steep glacier, the South Tahoma Glacier, at high speed during a violent winter storm on December 10, 1946, claiming the lives of all 32 service members on board. The scene was a brutal, chaotic disaster zone. When civilian climbers, park rangers, and military recovery teams finally reached the site in July 1947, they encountered a horrific and confusing landscape, driven by several harsh realities. Some searchers reported finding personal gear, intact luggage, and uniform items relatively undisturbed in certain sections of the wreckage, while other areas of the fuselage were utterly pulverized. Because the plane slammed into a moving glacier, the wreckage, cargo, and human remains were immediately subjected to shifting ice, avalanches, deep crevasses, and crushing pressure. A body or fragment visible in a specific spot one day could easily be buried or displaced by a shifting ice sheet or new snow slide days later. Because the military quickly locked down parts of the recovery operation due to extreme danger and operational sensitivity, civilian climbers who caught glimpses of the site sometimes exaggerated or misinterpreted what they saw, fueling wild post-war rumors that bodies were missing or that something supernatural had occurred. While the 32 Marines tragically lost their lives, and many were documented by recovery teams, the treacherous shifting ice and restricted access created lasting confusion. Due to extreme weather, shifting ice, and the sheer peril of the vertical terrain, the military ultimately abandoned efforts to extract all the victims, leaving the service members entombed within the glacial ice as both a solemn war grave and one of the most inaccessible crash sites in American history. What makes the C-46 crash deeply entwined with the birth of modern ufology goes beyond mere geographic coincidence. Kenneth Arnold was explicitly searching for this specific wreck when he was diverted into his historic June 24, 1947 sighting. Moreover, early investigators such as legendary ufologist Ray Palmer, who corresponded with Arnold, later highlighted bizarre personal testimonies from individuals linked to the search parties. Some accounts whispered of unusual military cargo manifests, strict intelligence cordons around the mountain, and rumors that military teams were looking for more than a routine transport accident. While many of these claims crossed into post-war folklore and speculation, they cemented the Mount Rainier crash as an integral piece of the high strangeness puzzle that defined the Pacific Northwest in the summer of 1947. Washington State holds a foundational status in the history of ufology, serving as the origin point for a rapid-fire succession of high strangeness events that shaped the modern UFO phenomenon and popular culture. In June 1947, days before flying saucers ever made headlines over Mount Rainier, the waters of Puget Sound became ground zero for the unknown. Harbor Master Harold Dahl reported an encounter with 6 donut-shaped metallic craft over Puget Sound near Vashon and Maury Islands. The incident involved allegations of heavy, slag-like metallic debris falling onto a boat and a subsequent encounter with an individual in a dark suit, laying the earliest conceptual groundwork for what would later become the Men in Black mythos. 3 days later, civilian pilot Kenneth Arnold took off from Chehalis, Washington, in his private plane, searching for a crashed Marine transport plane near Mount Rainier, with a destination and fueling stop in Yakima. While flying near the mountain, Arnold observed a chain of 9 high-speed, crescent-shaped objects moving across the peaks. His description to reporters of the objects moving like a saucer skipping across water popularized the terms flying saucer and flying disc in American media. After witnessing the objects, Arnold landed his plane at the Yakima airport. Shaken by what he saw, he immediately reported the encounter to local airport personnel and friends. Because Yakima served as his post-flight debriefing ground, the city became an unintended anchor point for the dawn of the UFO age, establishing a direct geographic bridge between central Washington aviation hubs and the rugged high strangeness corridors stretching from Mount Rainier across the Yakima Valley toward Mount Adams. Arnold's brush with high strangeness extended far beyond the skies. A month after his sighting, while investigating the Maury Island debris in Tacoma alongside publisher Ray Palmer and witness Harold Dahl, Arnold experienced a chilling series of intimidation tactics. Back on June 24, 1947, pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 high-speed, crescent-shaped objects near Mount Rainier. This sighting is particularly significant as it coined the term flying saucer and marked the beginning of the modern UFO era in the United States. Details of the Kenneth Arnold sighting. 1. Witness, Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot and businessman. 2. Location near Mount Rainier, Washington. 3. Event, while flying his small aircraft from Chehalis to Yakima, Washington, Arnold saw a bright flash of light. Initially thinking it was sunlight reflecting off another aircraft, he saw 9 high-speed objects flying in a chain formation. He estimated their speed to be at least 1,200 miles per hour, far faster than any known aircraft. 4. Description of objects. Arnold described the objects as crescent-shaped, like saucers skipping on water, which popularized the term flying saucer. 5. Aftermath. Arnold's sighting was widely reported in the media and is often credited with launching the modern UFO phenomenon. His account was considered credible due to his reputation as an experienced and reliable pilot. Other witnesses and corroboration. 1. L.G. Bernier, a resident of Richland, Washington, reported seeing similar objects around the same time as Arnold. Bernier described 3 objects flying almost edgewise toward Mount Rainier and speculated they might be from another planet. 2. Ethel Wheelhouse, in Yakima, Washington. Wheelhouse reported seeing several flying discs moving at high speeds around the same time as Arnold's sighting. Military intelligence documented her account during their investigation of Arnold's report. 3. Forest Service member. Another corroborating sighting came from a Washington State Forest Service member, who reported seeing flashes at 3 p.m. on June 24th over Mount Rainier, the same time as Arnold's sighting. This witness described the objects as moving in a straight line. While the physical sighting over Mount Rainier and the subsequent landing in Yakima provided the raw material, it was the unprecedented wave of media coverage that transformed Kenneth Arnold's experience into a permanent cultural phenomenon. When Arnold landed in Yakima and later spoke to reporters in Pendleton, Oregon, journalists were immediately struck by his background and demeanor. Arnold was not an erratic fringe figure or an attention seeker. He was a respected businessman, a seasoned pilot with thousands of hours of flight time, and a former deputy fire marshal. Unlike sensationalized accounts of sea monsters or ghosts, Arnold described what he saw with pilot-like precision. He estimated distances, speeds, and trajectories using aviation metrics, calculating that the 9 objects traveled from Mount Rainier to Mount Adams in roughly 102 seconds, meaning they were moving at an astonishing, unprecedented speed of over 1,200 miles per hour, at a time when standard fighter planes were barely breaking the sound barrier. Journalists found his calm, measured tone deeply compelling, which lent immediate gravity to his story. The transformation of Arnold's testimony by the press represents one of the most powerful instances of media-driven semiotic shift in modern history, turning a description of movement, kinematics, into a permanent archetype of form, morphology. When debriefing reporters, Arnold was attempting to convey the erratic, skipping trajectory of flat, disc-shaped, or crescent objects darting between mountain peaks. He explicitly stated that they flew in a chain-like fashion, as if linked together, and moved erratically, skimming through the air like a saucer skipping across water. He was describing a ricochet effect, not claiming they were shaped like ceramic dishware. In fact, Arnold later noted that several of the objects were flat-bottomed, while others were crescent-shaped or convex. In the fast-paced newsrooms of June 1947, sub-editors and headline writers operated under immense pressure to compress complex aerial observations into punchy, eye-catching banners. Phrases like "pilot sees fast-moving aerial objects" lacked the immediate, visceral hook required to sell newspapers in a post-war market, already saturated with atomic anxieties. By clipping the metaphor down to flying saucers and flying discs, the press inadvertently invented a visual shorthand that instantly imprinted on the public imagination. Within weeks, the public wasn't just looking for anomalous lights. They were scanning the clouds specifically for metallic plates. This linguistic shortcut permanently welded a specific geometric shape to the global concept of unidentified aerial craft, shaping decades of popular culture, science fiction design, and subsequent witness reports. Because the post-war American public was already primed with anxieties about advanced secret weapons, Cold War tensions, and technological leaps, the media coverage struck a massive nerve. Syndicated wire services carried the story from regional Pacific Northwest papers to coast front pages within 48 hours. This intense wall-to-wall media attention triggered a psychological feedback loop. As millions of readers learned about Arnold's sighting, they began looking up at the sky themselves, resulting in the first massive nationwide wave of UFO sightings in modern history. When Kenneth Arnold landed in Yakima and subsequently reported his sighting to military personnel at Hammer Field in California and McCord Field in Washington, the U.S. military's initial reaction was not immediate public dismissal. Instead, intelligence officers took the report remarkably seriously, launching confidential evaluations that would ultimately lay the groundwork for formal government UAP investigations. Because June 1947 was a volatile period of post-war aviation transitions, marked by the dawn of jet propulsion, supersonic testing, and rising Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union, military intelligence could not afford to ignore a credible, experienced pilot reporting high-speed, unconventional craft in strategic Pacific Northwest airspace. Air Force and Army Air Forces, AAF intelligence officers, conducted formal interviews with Arnold. They evaluated his flight logs, his calculation of the object's immense speed, surpassing 1,200 miles per hour, and his reputation as a level-headed businessman and deputy fire marshal. Crucially, military investigators never classified Arnold's report as a hoax, nor did they write him off as an attention seeker. They recognized that his descriptions did not match any known domestic or foreign aircraft in the U.S. inventory. While intelligence files housed at the time reflect genuine bafflement and concern behind closed doors, the official public posture was a delicate balancing act. Military leaders were deeply wary of causing public panic, or admitting that domestic radar and defense grids were entirely blind to high-speed unknown vehicles moving over sensitive nuclear and military corridors, such as Hanford and regional air bases. Unable to definitively identify the objects as weather balloons, mirages, or foreign espionage craft, military project files ultimately left the sighting officially categorized as unidentified. By taking Arnold's account seriously rather than sweeping it under the rug, military leadership inadvertently validated the reality of the phenomenon to their own analysts, triggering the chain of events that led directly to the creation of Project Sign later that year. Arnold's description of the objects as saucer-like led to the term flying saucer becoming synonymous with UFOs. The sighting sparked widespread public interest in UFOs and led to numerous other reports of similar sightings across the United States. Kenneth Arnold's June 1947 encounter over the Cascade Mountains and his debriefing right after landing in Yakima did more than just capture public imagination. It served as the direct catalyst for official government and military investigations into unidentified flying objects. Prior to Arnold's sighting, reports of unusual aerial phenomena were handled on an ad hoc, case-by-case basis by individual military branches without a centralized tracking system. The massive public attention and media frenzy sparked by Arnold's flying saucers forced the U.S. Air Force to take formal notice. Project Sign, 1947. The birth of formal air intelligence and the interplanetary debate. Established at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in late 1947 under the Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC, Project Sign represented the U.S. military's first institutionalized, systematic effort to scientifically collect, analyze, and evaluate reports of unidentified flying objects. The creation of Project Sign was driven by acute post-war anxiety. Military intelligence officers and scientists were operating under intense pressure due to several convergence factors. With the Iron Curtain falling and the Cold War escalating, the primary fear among defense planners was that these high-speed, unconventional craft were revolutionary, secret Soviet aircraft, potentially developed with captured German Nazi technology or aerospace scientists. Traditional radar systems and interceptor aircraft were consistently failing to capture or track the objects reliably. The military needed a dedicated analytical clearinghouse to handle the flood of incoming military and civilian reports following the summer 1947 wave. Behind closed doors at Wright-Patterson, Project Sign analysts became deeply polarized over what the data was actually telling them. This internal division gave rise to the very first official debates regarding extraterrestrial origins within the U.S. government. Many intelligence officers maintained that the objects had to be ultra-advanced terrestrial craft, either secret American projects operating under deep black budget compartmentalization or foreign adversaries pushing the boundaries of flight. By late 1948, a faction of Project Sign researchers compiled a top-secret document known as the Estimate of the Situation. This report concluded that the most logical explanation for the physical characteristics and flight capabilities of some UFOs was interplanetary, that they were craft of non-human extraterrestrial origin. The suppression of Project Sign's Estimate of the Situation in late 1948 marks a critical turning point in modern government transparency, establishing a structural precedent of public denial that persists to this day. When Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt E. Vandenberg reviewed the classified estimate, he did not dismiss the analysts as unhinged. Rather, he rejected their conclusion on strict bureaucratic and evidentiary grounds. Without a physical wreckage sample, a captured propulsion system, or biological proof, an official military declaration of extraterrestrial visitation was deemed an unacceptable leap of logic that would invite public panic, congressional interrogation, and professional ridicule. By ordering the copies burned or suppressed, Vandenberg set an unyielding threshold for proof that the military knew was virtually impossible to meet through eyewitness testimony alone. Vandenberg's rejection triggered an immediate administrative purge within Project Sign, sidelining analysts who leaned toward the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The project was subsequently reorganized into Project Grudge, 1949, which adopted a radically different operational mandate: explain away, debunk, or aggressively rationalize every incoming report, regardless of how anomalous the data actually was. This high-level veto forced a profound institutional split. On the surface, the U.S. military publicly maintained a posture of uniform skepticism, mocking flying saucers as mass hysteria, weather inversions, or optical illusions. Beneath the surface, however, intelligence units and technical centers quietly continued gathering, analyzing, and safeguarding anomalous data behind impenetrable walls of compartmentalization. This legacy of public dismissal masking private concern became the blueprint for decades of official secrecy surrounding UAPs. Project Sign proved that within months of Kenneth Arnold's sighting and his debrief in Yakima, the highest levels of the U.S. military were already grappling with the profound possibility that humanity was sharing airspace with an intelligence far beyond Earth. However, following the suppression of the Estimate of the Situation, the military's investigative apparatus underwent a deliberate ideological shift. Project Grudge, 1949, the debunking mandate. Operating under a philosophy of psychological management rather than open-minded scientific inquiry, Project Grudge actively sought to dismiss UFO reports. Its primary objective was to reassure the American public that there was nothing to fear, often forcing conventional explanations onto highly anomalous cases, a methodology later heavily criticized by internal investigators themselves. Project Blue Book, 1952, and Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. Triggered by massive, undeniable waves of sightings, most notably the July 1952 Washington, D.C. radar visual sightings where unidentified targets hovered over the White House and Capitol before outpacing interceptor jets. The Air Force realized Grudge was too blatantly biased to maintain public credibility. To restore professional rigor, the Air Force established Project Blue Book under the leadership of Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, who famously coined the term UFO to replace the loaded flying saucer. The bureaucratic twilight, 1952 to 1969, sad face under Ruppelt on subsequent directors. Blue Book adopted a more methodical scientific approach, but it remained fundamentally constrained by its public relations mandate. Over its 17-year lifespan, Blue Book investigated and cataloged more than 12,000 separate encounters. Yet, following the conclusions of the 1968 University of Colorado Commission Condon Report, which argued that further extensive study of UFOs could not be justified on scientific grounds, Project Blue Book was officially shut down in January 1969. Despite closing its doors and assuring the public that no UFO ever posed a national security threat, Blue Book left behind a legacy of unresolved files, cementing a permanent distrust between civilian researchers and military transparency. Arnold's report fundamentally changed how military intelligence viewed domestic airspace. Before 1947, unexplained objects were rarely categorized systematically. By establishing a formal reporting apparatus, the military acknowledged that civilian pilots and military personnel alike were encountering high-speed, unconventional craft operating with flight characteristics that defied known aviation limits. What began as a localized pilot's observation ending on a Yakima runway inadvertently laid the entire bureaucratic and investigative foundation for modern government UAP research, marking the absolute turning point where ufology began its long road forward. While Kenneth Arnold's initial sighting over Mount Rainier was a stark airborne encounter with the unknown, his subsequent entanglement in the fallout of the Maury Island incident dragged him into a labyrinth of intimidation, psychological warfare, and silent surveillance. What happened in the weeks following July 1947 transformed a pilot's sighting into the prototype for every conspiracy and men in black encounter that would follow in the decades to come. In late July 1947, Kenneth Arnold traveled to Tacoma, Washington, joining forces with pioneer ufologist Unfate magazine publisher Ray Palmer to investigate the bizarre debris collected by Harbormaster Harold Dahl. Staying at the historic Winthrop Hotel, Arnold and his close ally United Airlines Captain Emil J. Smith, who had experienced his own saucer encounter over Idaho on July 4th, quickly realized they were no longer dealing with a simple journalistic inquiry. During their stay, the men received a series of late-night anonymous telephone calls. The callers demonstrated an uncanny, real-time awareness of their movements, warning them in chilling, precise terms to drop the investigation immediately. They were told that continuing to collect, discuss, or transport the Maury Island metal slag would result in severe personal and professional consequences. The hotel room effectively became a pressure cooker. The callers did not argue the facts of the case. They projected an aura of total institutional control, signaling to Arnold and Smith that powerful, unseen forces viewed their investigation as a direct threat to national security. The psychological intimidation escalated from the telephone lines to the open road when Arnold and Smith attempted to cooperate with official channels. The two pilots gathered their remaining physical evidence, samples of the heavy slag, like metal dropped from the sky off Maury Island, and packed into a car to drive to nearby McChord Field, now Joint Base Lewis McChord, to hand the fragments directly over to Army Air Force's intelligence officers. As soon as they pulled away from the hotel, they noticed they were being tailed. A sleek, late-model black Buick sedan locked onto their bumper. No matter how they altered their speed, changed lanes, or navigated the Tacoma streets, the anonymous vehicle maintained a rigid, menacing distance, mirroring every turn. It was a textbook exercise in intimidation, a silent, visible reminder that they were entirely exposed and under constant watch. They successfully delivered the fragments to military intelligence, but the haunting presence of the car left an indelible psychological mark. The most terrifying escalation occurred not on the ground, but in the air, turning what felt like psychological harassment into an explicit physical threat against Arnold's life. Following their meetings in Washington, Arnold boarded his private plane at the airport in Pendleton, Oregon, to fly back home to Idaho. Having spent thousands of hours in the cockpit as a meticulous, safety-obsessed pilot, Arnold always conducted rigorous pre-flight inspections. Shortly after takeoff, as he gained altitude, his engine suddenly sputtered, coughed, and violently died. Deprived of power, Arnold was forced into a split-second emergency maneuver, expertly gliding his aircraft back down to a tense, low-altitude emergency landing. Once safely on the tarmac, Arnold popped the cowling to inspect the engine. To his absolute shock, he discovered that his fuel shutoff valve had been deliberately manipulated and turned off. This was not a mechanical failure or a structural defect. It was an act of deliberate sabotage. Furthermore, because Arnold kept his plane secured, the sabotage could only have been executed by someone with professional access to the airfield and the aircraft while it was parked. proving that the unseen forces tracking him possessed the reach to compromise his equipment. Years before ufologist Albert Bender coined the phrase "men in black" in the 1950s, and decades before Hollywood commercialized the trope of government agents in matching dark suits, Kenneth Arnold lived through the terrifying reality of it. His 1947 encounters bridged the gap between seeing an anomaly in the sky and colliding head-on with the terrestrial machinery of secrecy. It proved that the moment a civilian begins closing in on the truth of the phenomenon, the state steps in, not to investigate, but to silence. Preceding the famous events in Roswell, New Mexico, where a mysterious object crashed during a severe storm on a ranch around July 4, 1947, followed by the military's famous July 8 press release and rapid retraction, Kenneth Arnold's Pacific Northwest encounters opened the floodgates. Together, these convergent events galvanized public imagination, transforming a local pilot's observation into a permanent global phenomenon. The military made world headlines on July 8, 1947, when the Roswell Army Airfield issued a famous press release stating they had recovered a flying disc, before retracting the statement less than 24 hours later and claiming it was merely a downed weather balloon. The famous black and white images or illustrations, often associated with Kenneth Arnold's June 24, 1947 sighting over Mount Rainier, were not photographs taken by Arnold himself. During his actual flight from Chehalis toward Yakima, Arnold was flying solo in his Call Air airplane, completely startled by the sudden flash of light. He was entirely focused on watching the objects, tracking their movement against the mountain peaks, and calculating their speed. He did not have a camera with him, so no photographic record was captured during the actual encounter. Because newspapers and magazines desperately wanted a visual to accompany the sensational flying saucer headlines sweeping the nation, the media had to improvise. Artists and journalists drew rough sketches based strictly on Kenneth Arnold's verbal descriptions, showing flat, disc-like shapes or crescent configurations flying in a chain. Later historical features, documentaries, and archival collections created photo illustrations, composite images, or staged model shots, placing generic saucer shapes over photos of Mount Rainier to illustrate the story. While Arnold didn't photograph them, just 10 days later, on July 4, 1947, a United Airlines crew flying a DC-4 over Idaho witnessed a similar formation of disc-like objects pacing their plane. Later years produced famous photos like the 1950 McMinnville, Oregon photos, often associated with classic flying saucer imagery. But no authentic photograph exists of the original objects Kenneth Arnold saw over Mount Rainier. His sighting remains entirely a landmark event, built upon the credibility of an experienced pilot's eyewitness testimony. To be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archive Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown. Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3. The First Contact, The Paranormal State. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of real-life experiences, perfect for your daily plunge into consciousness exploration. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. Share your thoughts on today's episode.